Hello everyone, thank you for stopping by my channel. My name is Marcy, I'm an illustrator and also a big fan of journaling and planning, which is what we'll be talking about in today's video. I've made a couple of videos about my Hobonichi 5-year journal, and on those a few people asked me about the fonts that I like to use, so I thought I would elaborate on that a little bit today. In this video, I'll specifically be showing you how to use simple techniques to turn regular writing into lots of interesting and fun fonts that don't take a lot of time to do. Also really quickly, if you're subscribed mostly for my artwork, don't worry, that is also coming. I've just been having some technical difficulties. But for now, let's look at these fonts. And the first tip I have for you is to grab a kind of strong piece of paper and make a little list like this. The idea here is that if you make or find a font that you really love, you can document it here, and then when you're kind of in a hurry to get an entry into your planner or journal, you'll always have some ideas on hand. Someone also asked for a clear flat shot of mine, so here that is. Go ahead and pause it if you need. Let's also talk about materials really quickly. You can really use anything, but brush markers are probably the easiest and most versatile to use. And markers that have an actual brush rather than a felt tip give you even more range, but are possibly a little bit harder to control. But let me demonstrate why I like these. As long as you hold a brush marker in the same position the whole time, just like you would with a regular pen, horizontal lines will have a different thickness than vertical ones. So already, without any extra effort, this looks way more interesting. You can also easily do a very smooth transition between thinner and thicker lines. And if you can do cursive, then you can make a pretty effect by pressing down harder on the downstrokes. So that's why, although you don't need these, they will make your life easier. Paint markers are also a very handy option. Firstly, because you can use them on top of other stuff and correct mistakes if you need to, but also because they create a thicker line. Generally speaking, small flaws in your writing are way less noticeable if the line is thicker, as you can see in this example. Though of course there are some problems that even this can't camouflage. And I forgot to show you the actual brush, so here's a quick example of that. Because it's more flexible than a felt tip, you can draw a broader line with this. But when you go a lot thinner, it's more prone to get wobbly than it is with a felt tip. So keep that in mind. So now let's get into the actual fonts. And the main thing to know is that most of them are just regular writing with a bunch of different effects applied to it. And that's mostly what we'll be looking at. So for example, on this journal page of mine, both of these lines were done in the exact same letter. It's just that I made the bottom line thicker and added a pattern to it. And that was enough to make them look completely different. For the first part of this video, I'll be showing you the different techniques that you can use to add a lot more variety to your titles. If you're only here for the specific examples, that's the second half, so you can easily skip ahead to that chapter. But let's get into these. The first variable to think about is whether you want sharp or round angles on your words. The sharp corners look crisper, while the round corners will make this feel kind of friendlier and softer. The one on the left is probably also what you've been doing since you were a teenager, so it may take a second to get used to adding rounded corners, but it's not really hard. A second consideration is the height versus the width of your letters. That's especially handy to think about when you've got a certain amount of space to fill. Then I've got a subtle one that I think people are least likely to think about, and that's the height of the middle bars of all the letters. And with this, I would recommend keeping that bar at the same height for all the letters, because it does tend to look a little chaotic when you don't. Then you've got the thickness, kind of speaks for itself. The wider a letter is, the more noticeable. And next we've got the probably technically most difficult of them, the slant. If you do want slanted letters, the key is to hold your hand in the same position the whole time. You kind of want to write with your whole arm, if that makes sense, instead of just your fingers. But then if you're not so confident about your lettering, or you just want it to look very playful, you can have your letters start at 2 different heights, like here. I don't see that a lot, but I think it's very underrated. I really like the look of that. And then finally, you can also alternate the colors, which is a fun way to make even completely normal, regular writing look interesting. So the real fun in this is to experiment with all these different options and see how they go together and what you like. And then remember to save them on the piece of notepaper I told you to make. There is one final thing I wanted to touch on for this, and that's if you want to curve your text. Keep in mind that there is 2 different ways to do that, and they look very different. In this first example, I am curving the letters themselves along with the shape. So all the bottoms of the letters are pointing towards an imaginary middle point, basically. But you can also leave the letters themselves straight and just change their position along the curve, which looks very, very different, as you can see. Also, I guess that wasn't the last one after all. If you're concerned about putting your text neatly in the middle, I recommend starting with the middle letter of the word you're making. And this will just make it easier to space things out. So now that we've got all the techniques out of the way, I have Googled a list of pretty words and I'm going to start showing you some actual fonts. This will be a list of my personal favorites. And I'll get the most basic one out of the way first. This is just the block letter you probably used a lot in high school. If you're in high school now, tell me if this is something you still do. And you just add a shadow to it. This can be on any side of the text that you like, but make sure that they all go on the same side. I usually go bottom left, but it's also a really fun dramatic effect if you go straight down, like in this second example. This next one starts out basically the same way, just a block letter with sharp angles. But now you're going to add a big blob around it and then color the whole thing. This will add the effect of the text being a cutout, and I really like the look of it. Although this is also still really pretty if you add a little drop shadow to the letters. It looks best if you also add some splatters to the side so that it looks like a liquid. Here's a quick example of it in my journal, which I'm now realizing is even in the same colors. For this neon one, you'll need 2 or 3 colors, and ones that are similar if possible. You'll start with a very thick, very rounded letter in a light color. Then you'll add an outline to it that's a little bit thinner and a little bit darker. And if you want it to really pop, then add an even thinner line on it with yet another darker color. I started this with white in the middle, but there's really no reason you couldn't just start with a lighter color for your whole letter if that's easier for you to draw. And speaking of which, that is kind of what we're gonna do for the next one. Again, you want a thicker, rounder letter. And you're just gonna color most of it in, but you're going to leave just the top right parts white, as though there's a light shining on it. At which point you're going to grab a darker pen and add a shadow to the bottom left sides of all the parts. I'm not sure I'm being super clear about that, so what I mean is when you've got like a letter B, like here, each little curve of that has a highlight on the top right of it and a shadow on the bottom left. I hope that makes sense. For the next one, you want very broad letters with very sharp corners on them. And you'll see why when I get the whole word in. We're basically putting letters inside other letters. So we've got these big block letters, and then we're putting just lines inside of them. They probably won't be perfectly even, or at least they aren't for me, but that's not really noticeable. And like a lot of them, this one's even more fun if you add a drop shadow to it. For the next one, you're going to start the exact same way you did with the neon. A thick outline with soft corners in a light color. But this time, instead of outlines, we're going to add a lot of little dots. I like to use this one to imitate sand or snow, or if you use really interesting colors, even glitter. Oh, and also bread and cookies and stuff. You can't really mess this up too badly as long as you make sure that the darker color isn't too dark. And if it does look a little bit too contrasty, then with a lot of different kinds of paper, you can go over it with a very light color again to blend it up a little bit. And here's the example from my planner where I did use it as snow. Next we're going to go back to the block letter with a drop shadow, but this time you'll be adding some wavy shapes to the bottom of all of them to make them look drippy. I happen to have chosen this particular type of letter, but that's not really necessary. And you could even do it all in one solid color as long as you make sure that you don't fill up the holes in your letters, because then it could get a little hard to read. My favorite time that I've used this one was here to represent water. I love this font because you can really just make a mess and it'll look cool. And if you like the other font on this page, that one is also coming up. But first, I'm going to give you a kind of bad example of a gradient, where you'll make a solid letter in a light color, then go over about 2/3 of it with a slightly darker color, and then only the bottom third with an even darker color. Now on the paper I normally use, this color combination works for this, but this is a very thirsty paper and now that middle purple is quite dark. This is also a perfect application for colored pencil if you have it, because then you really only need to use one color on top and just press harder towards the bottom. Next I've got a very playful looking letter. And instead of going for straight lines or an outline, you're just going to make all the letters out of little ovals. This is one of the easiest ones to do, I would say, because you're really scribbling a lot. But it looks kind of clean at the end, and I think it's fun. Then here I've got one that's a little bit more time consuming, though not really difficult, where you're just going to start with normal letters, but make sure you make them kind of wide, so you'll have room to add something to this. Because when you've got that down, you're going to add a curvy outline to the whole thing. Or at least that is what I'm doing for this one. And the result is a very shaky letter. And I did the outline here, but you can totally just wobble the entire letter instead. It's fun for spooky things like this book review I did here, or to represent your caffeine jitters after having too much coffee. Then we've got one that's a small modification on the regular old block letter, where you add a little triangle on all the ends of the letters. This has kind of a Gothic or medieval look to it, and the main thing to know if you're going to draw this is to add all the triangles from the start, because if you make them regular letters first, then some of them will end up taller than others, because, for example, an I will have a triangle on the top and bottom, but a T will only have them on the bottom and the sides, so it'll be shorter. So add them on from the start. You may have noticed I stopped adding drop shadows, but you can totally do that to all of them. I'm just trying to save you some time here. Next we're going to do one that looks like stickers. I chose a thick round letter. You don't have to, but make sure that there is a bit of room in between all of them. Because at the end we're going to add a really thin shadow to one side of it, and it's going to look kind of like you stuck a lot of little stickers down. Just like in the previous example with that, you don't have to put them on the bottom left, you can do the top right as well, but keep it all on the same side. It'll just look more realistic that way. Next is one of the more complicated ones to do. I hope this still falls within the realm of kind of quick and easy, but it does require a touch more focus than the other ones, because we will be making all of these letters thinner at the bottom and thicker at the top. So for example, with this N, both of the lines that would normally be straight both taper towards the middle of the letter at the bottom. And not only are you shaping it like that, but you're also going to make the top parts thicker. Or if you've got something like a B or an E, then the top line will be longer than the bottom one. I hope I'm making sense. This is a really fun, spooky font that you used to see a lot in horror posters and comic books, so I still wanted to include it even though it's maybe a little more complicated to do. And speaking of complicated, I'm gonna hit you with a cursive one, because I think that looks prettiest, but I think you can totally do this with a different kind of writing. But you will want paint pens for this one, or you can use black for the top layer. And we're just going to write a word normally, and then move down and left a little bit and write the word again. And it's just a different way to add a fun shadow to the letters. For this next one, we'll be taking advantage of the fact that, like I said, brush pens make a thinner line when you draw sideways. I'm adding these little thin lines to everything. And the one thing to pay attention to when you're doing this is the way you're positioning your hand. So as you can see with mine here, I'm not changing the position of that at all. Instead, I am moving my whole hand to the side. But if you find that this is difficult for you, you can totally draw a block letter the normal way, fill it in, and then add the smaller lines to it. Next, I'm gonna demonstrate my very favorite thing to do. And for this, you're gonna grab yourself a brush or some kind of brush pen and really just go as messy as you can. I don't think you can really get this wrong. You alternate the pressure, the size, the font. As long as you keep them kind of close together, it'll be clear that it's a word, and it'll look really extravagant and fun, and it won't have been difficult at all. And out of everything I've shown in this video, this is the one I hope you'll all pick up. There was also a great example of this on the page I showed you earlier. And while I'm on the topic of brushes, here's another fun, easy one to do. This kind of a brush font is messy on purpose. You make it with quick, sharp lines. This one's very quick and fun to do. I had an extra fun application of this one in my planner when we had sushi and watched a horror movie because it's reminiscent of horror movie covers, but also Japanese brush calligraphy. This is another one I don't think you can really mess up, so definitely give it a try. And lastly, here's one that I forgot to do when I was showing you all the letters with outlines. And for this one, you'll want to build the letters out of multiple shapes. Like when you do normal writing, every part that is a separate line for you would also be a separate line in this font. It's all made of rectangles and little macaroni pieces. I also feel like I owe you an apology for the messiness of this one. For some reason, I ended up putting the paper a little bit too far away from the camera. One of the more famous current examples of this font is the Stardew Valley logo. And that was all the fonts I had to show you. I hope this was helpful, especially because I experienced the largest amount of technical issues I've ever had in a single video. I've recorded the video twice and the audio 4 times, so I just really hope that was worth it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!